Bikers laugh at a helpless teen. When his dad arrives, they go silent. The city streets hummed with the usual afternoon bustle. Cars honking, pedestrians weaving through traffic, and the distant sounds of street vendors calling out to passers-by. But in one quiet corner of the urban sprawl, a different kind of chaos was unfolding. A group of bikers had gathered in front of a small, run-down convenience store. Their motorcycles, black and chrome, gleamed in the harsh sunlight. They were a notorious gang, feared by the locals for their brazen attitude and their reputation for intimidation. The air around them was thick with a sense of power, the kind that only comes from a group of people who know they can control any situation. Among the group, the leader, a man with tattoos covering his arms and a scar running down his cheek, stood with his arms crossed, watching a young teen who was kneeling in front of him. The kid, barely 17, was dressed in a band t-shirt and ripped jeans, his hands trembling as he looked up at the bikers. His name was Ethan, and he'd been at the wrong place at the wrong time. The bikers laughed at his expense, their voices booming as they circled around him. The teen, trapped between the concrete and the cold, menacing figures, had nowhere to go. One of the bikers, a bulky man with a thick beard and an almost comically large leather jacket, nudged Ethan with his boot. The force of the shove sent the kid sprawling onto the pavement. "Look at this little guy," the bearded biker laughed, the sound like gravel grinding against rock. "Think you're tough, huh? What are you gonna do now?" Ethan pushed himself up, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there. A quiet defiance that hadn't been snuffed out yet. He wasn't the type to back down easily, but these bikers were different. They were a group of bullies who thrived on seeing others suffer, and Ethan knew he was in way over his head. "Please, just leave me alone," Ethan pleaded, trying to steady himself on his shaky legs. His voice cracked, betraying the fear he felt. "I didn't do anything." The leader of the gang stepped forward, a cruel grin forming on his lips. "You don't need to do anything, kid. We just find you entertaining." The other bikers chuckled, as if on cue. The laughter echoed off the buildings, creating an oppressive silence that hung in the air. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, but he refused to let them see him break. He clenched his fists, the anger building inside him, but he knew better than to try anything. He wasn't strong enough to fight back, and even if he tried, the odds were stacked against him. "Come on, boy, get up," the leader taunted, bending down and lifting Ethan by his shirt collar, yanking him to his feet. "Don't make us laugh more. You don't belong here." The gang was closing in, the sound of their boots against the pavement becoming louder. They had him cornered, and the fear in Ethan's eyes was like fuel for their twisted amusement. But just as the bikers were about to go further, something shifted in the air. A car's engine rumbled in the distance. It wasn't just any engine, though. It was powerful, unnervingly so. As the sound grew closer, the bikers momentarily stopped, looking toward the street, confusion and curiosity on their faces. And then the car came into view. A sleek, black sedan turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the haze of afternoon light. It rolled slowly toward the group of bikers, the engine purring with a quiet menace. The car came to a stop just a few feet away, and the doors opened. Out stepped a tall man, his posture rigid, his face stern. He wore a military uniform, decorated with medals and badges that glinted in the sunlight. His eyes were cold, but there was a sense of authority in his gaze that made even the bikers pause. The leader's face twitched when he saw the man, the laughter dying in his throat. The tension in the air thickened as the man stepped forward, his boots clicking against the concrete with each step. He wasn't just any man. This was Sergeant James Hargrave, a decorated war hero, and the father of the teen they had been tormenting. James stood tall, his eyes never leaving the bikers. The group fell silent, the earlier mockery replaced with a palpable sense of unease. The leader's smirk faltered, and for the first time, the bikers realized they might have made a mistake. "Is there a problem here?" James's voice was calm, but the weight of it was enough to make even the toughest of the bikers second-guess their actions. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a power in his words that couldn't be ignored. The bikers hesitated, their bravado slipping away as they faced the man who had seen and done things they could only imagine. The leader opened his mouth, but no words came out. The tough, menacing demeanor that had defined their group suddenly seemed fragile under the weight of James's presence. Ethan, still on his knees, looked up at his father. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by something stronger, a sense of safety. He knew his dad wasn't going to let anyone hurt him. Not today. And for the first time, the bikers went silent. The tension was suffocating. The bikers stood frozen, caught between the growing pressure of their own bravado and the undeniable authority radiating from Sergeant James Hargrave. They were used to intimidating people, breaking them down, showing them who was in charge. But now, in front of this man, their usual confidence wavered. The balance had shifted, and they weren't sure how to respond. James stood unwavering, his posture rigid, eyes locked on the leader of the gang. The leader, a man with a rough face and a hard demeanor, tried to regain his composure. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the situation had caught him off guard. He had never expected anyone to challenge his control like this, especially not a man like Hargrave. "What's the problem, son?" James's voice was measured and calm, but there was a sharpness to it that commanded respect. His gaze remained steady, and there was no sign of fear in his eyes, only a quiet confidence that made the bikers uneasy. The leader swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder at the rest of the gang, but none of them dared to speak. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Ethan, still kneeling on the ground, watched his father. The fear that had once clouded his eyes was now replaced with a deep sense of relief. He had never seen his father in action like this before. The stories his dad had shared with him about his time in the military were one thing, but to see him standing there, commanding the attention of an entire group of intimidating bikers, was something else entirely. The leader of the bikers took a step forward, trying to find his words, but his voice faltered. We didn't mean," he began, but the words didn't come out right. He was trying to regain control of the situation, but the presence of James was overwhelming. "Didn't mean what?" James cut him off sharply. "Didn't mean to mess with my son? Didn't mean to intimidate him? Didn't mean to threaten him?" The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their usual cocky attitudes replaced by a hint of uncertainty. This wasn't the type of confrontation they were used to. "I'm not asking you for an explanation," James continued, his voice cold, yet steady. "I'm telling you that this is where it ends. You've made your point, but I don't care who you think you are. You don't get to do this. Not while I'm here." The leader of the gang took a step back, his eyes flicking to his men for support, but none of them moved. The weight of James's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and the bikers were starting to realize that this wasn't a fight they could win, not without risking more than they were willing to lose. James glanced at Ethan, then back at the group of bikers. "You can walk away now. Apologize and go back to whatever it is you do when you're not busy being cowards." His tone was icy, but there was no anger, only a quiet command that left no room for negotiation. The bikers stood there, tense and unsure. They had thought they could overpower the kid, take what they wanted, and leave without consequence. But this was different. The man before them was not someone they could push around. His very presence challenged everything they believed about power. After what felt like an eternity, the leader of the gang finally took a step back, his shoulders sagging slightly. The bravado was gone, replaced by a reluctant acknowledgement that they were outmatched. He nodded toward his gang, signaling for them to leave. Without another word, the bikers turned, mounting their motorcycles and slowly revving the engines. The sound of the bikes starting up was deafening, but it was the absence of their taunts and jeers that spoke volumes. They had been beaten, not in a fight, but by the sheer force of James's presence. As they rode off, James didn't take his eyes off them until they disappeared around the corner. Only then did he turn back to Ethan, who was still on his knees, his eyes wide, staring at his father with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Dad," Ethan breathed out, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I thought they were gonna... James crouched down in front of him, his expression softening. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it gently. I know, kid. I know. Ethan looked up at him, his lips trembling slightly. But how? How did you do that? I mean, they were huge, and I thought... James smiled, a small but reassuring grin. It's not about size, son. It's about knowing when to stand your ground. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is just show up. Ethan's heart swelled with pride. His father wasn't just a war hero, a decorated officer. He was a man who stood for what was right, who never backed down from protecting the ones he loved. Ethan had known this, but seeing it in action had made him realize just how lucky he was. Together, they stood there for a moment, watching the last of the bikers disappear down the street. The chaos of the moment was over, and all that remained was the quiet peace of knowing they had made it through. But as they turned to walk away, something caught Ethan's eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper on the ground. He bent down to pick it up, unfolding it to reveal a single message scrawled in dark ink. This isn't over. Ethan's heart sank, but James didn't miss a beat. His hand rested on his son's shoulder once more, steadying him. We'll deal with that when it comes, son, James said. But for now, let's just go home. The walk back to the car felt different. The usual tension in Ethan's shoulders had melted away, replaced by a quiet, almost surreal calm. His father, Sergeant James Hargrave, had always been a larger-than-life figure to him. But today, seeing him stand up to the gang, Ethan realized just how much strength and authority his dad truly had. It wasn't just the medals or the stories. It was the way he carried himself, the way he protected without hesitation. As they reached the black sedan, Ethan couldn't shake the unease that lingered in his gut. The bikers were gone, but the words on the crumpled piece of paper still echoed in his mind. This isn't over. What do you think it means? Ethan asked, his voice quieter than usual as he climbed into the passenger seat. His hand was still trembling slightly from the encounter, but the fear was now replaced with curiosity. James started the car and pulled away from the curb, his eyes flicking toward his son. It means someone's got a vendetta, he said, his tone low and steady. Bikers like those, they don't back down easily. But that doesn't matter right now. Ethan looked out the window, his mind racing. But what if they come back? What if they're after you, not me? You saw how they looked at you. They weren't scared of anyone else. But when they saw you, James kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tightening slightly. I can handle myself. And you, he glanced over at Ethan. You did great out there. You stood your ground. That's the most important thing. You're stronger than you know. Ethan nodded, but the weight of his father's words was interrupted by a loud beep from James's phone. He glanced at the screen and sighed. It's my CO, he muttered, swiping the phone to answer. Hargrave, he said into the phone, his voice shifting slightly. Ethan could only make out bits and pieces of the conversation, but it was clear from his father's tone that whatever was happening was serious. His expression hardened, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if the bikers were just the beginning of a bigger storm. When James finally hung up, he exhaled sharply. That was the base. They need me for a mission. There's been an incident. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. An incident? What kind of incident? James paused, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. I can't talk about it right now, but it's something I have to handle. Just stay with me, okay? I promise, I'll be back soon. Ethan's mind raced. His father had been involved in more than one dangerous mission, but this felt different. The urgency in his voice, the way his eyes briefly flashed with concern. Ethan had seen it before. He had witnessed his father's calm demeanor in the face of danger, but this was different. The calmness didn't extend to his actions this time. Something had shaken him. They drove in silence for a while. The city passed by in a blur of traffic and buildings, but Ethan couldn't focus on the familiar sights. He was too consumed by what had just happened, and the lingering feeling that the gang wasn't going to just let them go. James pulled into the driveway of their home, a small house on the outskirts of the city. It had always been a refuge for them, a place to retreat after his father's long deployments and missions. But today, The house didn't feel like a refuge. It felt like a temporary shelter. "Come on inside, son," James said, his voice softer now. "Get some rest. We'll talk when I get back." Ethan didn't protest. He knew his father well enough to understand when words weren't enough. He needed action, not explanations. But as he stepped out of the car and followed his father inside, the message on the crumpled paper continued to haunt him. James disappeared into his office, and Ethan, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and exhaustion, made his way to his room. As he sat down on his bed, he pulled the paper out of his pocket again. The words still burned into his mind. "This isn't over." Ethan tossed the paper onto the desk, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger than a group of bikers was at play. What had started as a simple confrontation now felt like the tip of the iceberg, and Ethan had a sinking feeling that his dad's past, and the world he tried to shield him from, was about to come crashing into their lives in a way they weren't ready for. Just then, the sound of the front door slamming open broke his thoughts. Ethan jumped to his feet, rushing to the living room to find his father standing by the door, his coat already on, his military bag slung over his shoulder. "Dad, where are you going?" Ethan asked, panic rising in his voice. "I have to go," James replied, his expression hard but softening as he looked at Ethan. "Something's happened. I'll be back as soon as I can, but you need to stay safe. Lock up, don't open the door to anyone but me. Understand?" Ethan nodded, but he wasn't sure if he understood anything at all. His father's urgency, the way he was leaving without any explanation, it all felt wrong. As James turned to leave, Ethan hesitated for a moment, then called out, "Dad, be careful." James paused, his back still facing Ethan. For a brief second, he turned his head slightly, his eyes softening as they met his son's. "Always." With that, he stepped out, leaving Ethan standing in the silence of the living room. Ethan sat in his room, the silence around him almost deafening. His father had left in a hurry, and the weight of his absence felt heavier than usual. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a hollow shell. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, almost mocking in its precision. He glanced over at the crumpled paper again, the words still haunting him. "This isn't over." The sun had long set, casting the house into shadows. Ethan had tried to distract himself, picking up a book, scrolling through his phone, anything to occupy his mind, but nothing worked. His thoughts kept returning to the bikers, to the message, and to his father's mysterious departure. There was something Ethan wasn't being told. He could feel it in his bones. His father had always kept his work separate from their family life, but today had felt different. The urgency in James's eyes when he'd left, the way he had avoided answering Ethan's questions, it was all too much. Unable to sit still, Ethan stood up and walked over to his father's office, the one room in the house that had always been off-limits to him. He'd never had any reason to snoop around in there before, but tonight, something pushed him. His dad had always been so protective of this space, so private about the work he did. What if there was something in there that could explain what was happening? The door creaked as Ethan slowly turned the knob. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The office smelled faintly of leather and cologne, a mixture that always reminded Ethan of his father's strength and stability. But now it felt almost foreign, as though it no longer belonged to the man he knew. The desk was cluttered with papers, files, and photographs. Nothing out of the ordinary. Ethan had seen his father work late into the night in this room, but never had he dared to look through any of it. His eyes scanned the piles of documents before landing on a folder that stood out among the rest. It was plain, with no markings on the front, but it was slightly out of place, as though it had been moved recently. He reached for it, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. With shaking hands, he opened the folder and began flipping through its contents. The pages were filled with names, addresses, and cryptic notes that made little sense to him. But as he turned the pages, one thing caught his eye: a photograph. It was a picture of his father, young and in military uniform, standing beside a group of men. The image was faded, the edges worn, but it was the man standing next to James that caught Ethan's attention. He looked familiar, too familiar. The man in the photo was the leader of the biker gang, the one who had mocked Ethan earlier. His face, though younger, was unmistakable. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he put the pieces together. His father hadn't just been a soldier. He had been involved with something much darker, something tied to the bikers. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The message from the gang, "This isn't over," it wasn't just a threat. It was a warning to his father. Before he could process everything, Ethan heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. He quickly shoved the folder back into the drawer, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't ready for the truth yet. Not like this. The door to the house opened, and footsteps echoed in the hall. It was his father. James had returned. Ethan rushed to the living room, his mind still racing. He needed answers. His father couldn't just leave him in the dark anymore. James entered, looking just as he had earlier. Composed, confident, but with something in his eyes that Ethan had never seen before. Something that spoke of secrets, of battles fought in the shadows. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice firm, more demanding than it had ever been before. "We need to talk." James stopped in his tracks, his gaze locking onto Ethan's. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared. "I know what you're going to ask," James said quietly, his tone unexpectedly soft. "And I know you're not going to like it." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. "What's going on, Dad? Why did you leave like that? And what about those bikers? Why did they have a picture of you? Why did they say, 'This isn't over'? You've been involved with them, haven't you?" James closed his eyes for a moment, as though collecting his thoughts. He let out a long, tired breath before sitting down on the couch. Ethan remained standing, not willing to back down. "I wasn't always the man, you know," James said, his voice low. "Before I became your father, before I became a soldier, I was part of something else. Something I've tried to put behind me." Ethan felt his stomach drop. This wasn't the answer he had expected. "What do you mean? What were you involved in?" James looked up at him, his expression both pained and resigned. "There was a time when I was working undercover for the government. I infiltrated a group, those bikers. They were involved in arms dealing, smuggling, and other illegal activities. I thought I could stop them. I thought I could do some good. But I didn't count on the personal consequences. One of the men I was working with, the leader, I made a mistake. I let him get away, and he disappeared." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "So, they're after you? They're coming after us because of something you did?" James nodded slowly. "Yes, I've spent years trying to put that life behind me. But now they're back, and they've found me. This isn't just about you anymore, Ethan. They're not going to stop until they get what they want." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. The man he had always looked up to, the man who had seemed invincible, was human after all. He wasn't just his father. He was a man with a past that was now catching up with him. But one thing was clear. They weren't going to let this happen without a fight. The night was still, the air thick with tension. Ethan stood there, trying to process everything his father had just told him. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in a way he hadn't expected. His dad, Sergeant James Hargrave, wasn't just the man he'd always admired. He was a man with a past, one that had come back to haunt them. James stood up from the couch, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm, like a promise. "You've heard the truth, son," James said, his voice steady despite the weight of the revelation. "Now we face what's coming. Together." Ethan nodded, his mind still reeling. "But how? How are we supposed to stop them? If they want revenge, they'll come after you, and us, no matter what." James took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them. We've got one chance to end this before it goes too far." Ethan felt a surge of fear and determination course through him. His father was right. They couldn't just sit around and hope the bikers would leave them alone. If they were going to survive, they had to act now. And Ethan was ready, more than ready, to fight alongside his father. James walked over to the door, pausing for a moment before turning back to Ethan. "Stay close, son. And no matter what happens, don't leave my side. We'll get through this together." Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him as he followed his father out the door. The weight of the situation had settled into his chest, but it wasn't fear that he felt now. It was a resolve, commitment to his family. He wasn't just going to let the bikers threaten his dad, his home. They would pay for what they had done. The black sedan sped through the streets, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Ethan's heart raced in his chest, but his focus remained on the road ahead. They were on their way to confront the bikers, to end whatever they had started. James kept his eyes on the road, but there was something about the way he held himself. Something that told Ethan this wasn't just another mission for his father. This was personal. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the car slowed. James's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "We're close," he said quietly. The tension in the car was palpable. Ethan's hands clenched in his lap, his body tensed as they turned onto a deserted industrial street. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light on the abandoned warehouses that lined the road. This was the last place anyone would expect to find trouble, but Ethan knew better. This was where the bikers had made their home, their base of operations. James stopped the car a few hundred yards away from the main warehouse. He turned to Ethan, his eyes steely with determination. "This is it," he said. "Stay low, stay quiet. We move fast." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words. They didn't have time for mistakes. Every move had to be calculated. They got out of the car, the cool night air biting at their skin. James moved silently, his military training evident in every step. Ethan followed close behind, doing his best to mimic his father's movements. The air was thick with anticipation, and the sound of distant engines reached their ears. The bikers were close. They reached the warehouse door, and James signaled for Ethan to stop. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. There was no turning back now. James stepped forward, pulling out a small flashlight and scanning the entrance. The door was unlocked. Slowly, he pushed it open, the hinges creaking quietly in the silence. They slipped inside, the darkness of the warehouse swallowing them whole. Inside, the bikers were gathered. There were at least a dozen of them, huddled together near a makeshift table, maps spread out in front of them. They hadn't seen James and Ethan enter. The moment felt like a lifetime, the tension in the air palpable. James glanced over at Ethan, his eyes focused and determined. Without a word, he nodded and they moved. They moved like shadows, each step deliberate. As they got closer, the leader of the gang, the same man who had threatened Ethan earlier, looked up, his eyes locking onto them. His face froze in recognition. His hand instinctively went to the waistband of his jacket, reaching for something hidden beneath it. But it was too late. James lunged forward, his training taking over. He disarmed the leader in one swift motion, sending the weapon clattering to the ground. The bikers scrambled to react, but James and Ethan were faster. They knew exactly what needed to be done. A brutal fight ensued, but it was clear from the start that the bikers were outmatched. James fought with precision, taking down one after another, his movements swift and calculated. Ethan, though not as experienced, moved with a newfound confidence. He was no longer the helpless teen. He was part of something bigger now. Within minutes, the gang was subdued. The leader was on the ground, panting, his pride shattered. He glared at James and Ethan, but there was nothing he could do now. James stood over him, his face cold. "This ends tonight," he said. "You've made a mistake, and now you're going to pay for it." The leader's eyes burned with fury, but he didn't respond. He knew better than to challenge James now. Ethan looked around at the wreckage, his breath heavy in his chest. They had done it. They had taken control of the situation. But it wasn't over yet. James looked down at him, a small, proud smile forming on his face. "You did good, son," he said, his voice low but full of pride. "We're a team." Ethan met his father's gaze, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. They had survived. They had taken down the bikers, and they had done it together. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. But for now, they had won. And for the first time, Ethan felt truly invincible, because he wasn't just his father's son. He was his partner,